Hello. In this video, we're going to show you how to make sugar cookies into Frosties. Snowmen, snow women, snow people, whatever you prefer. And you won't need to roll out any cookie dough for this, though you will need some cookie dough that is for a sugar cookie cutout type of recipe. To make the cookies in this video, as I mentioned, you will need a recipe of sugar cookie dough, the kind that you use for the cutouts, even though we won't be rolling out any cookie dough for this recipe. We'll be using it more like a drop cookie. You do want the sugar cookie cutout dough, though, whether you're buying some ready-made from the grocery store or making your own. And we will share a recipe here that you can use, or you're welcome to use your own or buy ready-made cookie dough. If you do the drop cookie type sugar cookie, then it's going to lose its form when it bakes, but the sugar cookie cutout dough is a bit firmer and will hold up in the baking process. You'll also need some frosting in order to work as a kind of glue to hold the hats together, especially, and potentially also the mouths and other things you might want to put on your Frosties. So any kind of frosting is fine. If you have a ready-made frosting you'd like, that's fine. Or you can use your own recipe. We'll also share a really simple recipe here that works well that we've used for these cookies. If you'd like to just make something quick and easy with a little bit of powdered sugar and either milk or orange juice or a little water. You'll need mini chocolate chips, not the regular sized ones. Those are a bit too big for these cookies. Or some other miniature candy that's a similar size to those mini chocolate chips. As you can see here in the decorated cookies, these chips are pretty small, so something that's miniature like that. And then something for the hats. Gumdrops are a possibility. We've used Kisses and Rolos here, but you could also do mini peanut butter cups, anything of that size, maybe the dot gum candy that's a bit like gumdrop as well would work, anything like that that you like. And then licorice lace in order to make the scarves, and potentially for other parts as well. You can use licorice lace for mouths, you can use it to make arms. So some licorice lace will be helpful too. Here is a cookie dough recipe. This is the one that I like. It's from Better Homes and Gardens. I use it every year. It works really well for me. And normally I roll out my cookies for cookie cutters. That's this recipe. But I've used it here to make these frosty cookies with like a drop cookie style rather than rolling them out. So if you're going to make cookie dough and haven't made it yet, you can go ahead and pause the video and follow this recipe basically until you get to step 3. We will come back in at step 3 and work on making the frosty cookies and assembling them to bake. So this is a fairly straightforward sugar cookie recipe. You just let the butter soften and beat it, and then add in the sugar and the baking powder and salt, and beat again until it gets creamy, and then add in the egg and vanilla and beat it again to get everything mixed in, and then add in as much flour as you can with your electric mixer and stir the rest in by hand, making sure it's all completely mixed in. And once you've done that, I do recommend that you chill the dough for at least 30 minutes. It does make it easier to shape them and form them, although you could certainly do it if you're in a hurry without chilling it first. So go ahead and you can pause the video if you'd like and work on this. I will also go to the next recipe, which is for powdered sugar frosting, and you can make that as well if you're going to make some frosting, some very quick frosting to go with this, or you can make your own frosting recipe or use a jar. We will talk a little bit more about the cookie dough when you have everything together. But here is the frosting recipe. You just basically need, and I didn't even do this much. You might even only just need to cut this in half and do a half cup of powdered sugar. It depends on how much you're going to make, but you could start with just a half cup of powdered sugar and a half tablespoon of either milk or orange juice or just plain water. And then if you want to color it, some food coloring, but I would recommend that you start by not coloring any of it and just mixing it so that it's a nice thick food coloring. This is what the frosting looks like when it's been mixed. You can see that it's smooth and it sticks really well to the spoon. It's not a drizzle frosting, but it's a nice thick frosting. So go ahead and mix up the cookie dough and chill it if you're going to, and maybe while you're chilling the dough, you can go ahead and make the frosting. You can pretty much with the frosting just add a little bit of extra liquid if you need it, if it's too thick, but I found that the proportions in the recipe worked perfectly for me. So, and if it's a little bit too thin and it seems to be running off of the spoon, then obviously you can add a little bit more sifted powdered sugar. You want it to be a nice thick frosting that's more like a paste, something that you could spread if you were going to spread it on top of sugar cookie cutouts as a decoration, then that's the kind of frosting you're looking for here, not something that's going to drizzle and run off of the cookie, because we need it to work as a glue. So once your dough is prepped and ready to bake, you'll want to start assembling the Frosties, the snowmen. And you can, if you want, if you like proportions and you like to be accurate, you can make different sizes. Make 1 inch, 3/4 inch, and 1/2 inch balls of dough and stack them on top of each other with the largest one on the bottom. Or you can just do them all approximately the same if you're not fussy about it. Honestly, a little bit bigger for the head is helpful because it gives you more room to do things for the face, which is where most of the decoration happens. And a bigger piece for the head also helps to support the piece of candy that goes on top. But you can do what you want. The ones that I made initially that I showed you one from the beginning is has about a 1.5 inch head, but the ones that I'm making here are probably more about the same size. So here you can see I have 3 that are approximately the same size, and I used a ruler to measure them, and they all measure about the same. So I just basically stack them on top of each other, and I'm just going to gently press them. You don't need to do much because when they go into the oven, the dough is naturally going to bake together a little bit, just enough to make sure that they're against each other. Once you have your snow people assembled on your baking sheet, and you might want to use parchment paper for this. I always use parchment paper with my sugar cookie recipes because this dough has a lot of butter in it, and so it can tend to get brown pretty fast. It also helps to prevent them from sticking, especially if you're using older baking sheets. Another option is to use a silicone mat, but I usually use parchment paper, as you can see here. So assemble your cookies. And another thing I didn't mention about the size of the dough balls that you form, you might even just want to think about forming them so that the heads are large enough to accommodate whatever kind of candy you're putting on top. Some kinds of candy are larger than others, and if you're interested and concerned about proportions, you can just make the sizes of the heads according to the kind of candy. So I've kind of shaped them to make sure that they fit. Since I have kisses and Rolos for my hats, I've shaped them a little bit to accommodate that. But once you have them formed and they're stacked together, you can add the mini chocolate chips or other candies. If you're doing mini chocolate chips like I have, it may be difficult to see, although you might be able to notice here if you look closely that most of the pieces have been pressed into the dough with the pointed part down toward the dough, but for the nose I have the pointed part sticking up, so it kind of looks like the point of a nose. So you can do that if you want. They can be hard though sometimes to manage because they're so small, and you might need to help kids with this particular part of it. But do what you want and decorate them however you'd like. You can put others in as well. If you're making larger cookies, you might even be able to make a smile with these mini chocolate chips. But for this size that I'm doing, which is more about between probably 1/2 inch and 1 inch for diameter for the head, the chips would be too much to make a smile. So I can show you other ways to do that here when they're done baking. So here are my cookies assembled and ready to go. It's hard to see that the points are sticking up here, but you can maybe see it in this one compared to the others. But yeah, the pointed part of my chips are sticking up for the nose. So at least when you look at it closely, you can tell that there's a point there on the chip. So your cookies, once they're ready to go into the oven, you'll want to bake them at 325. I never bake mine above 325, whether I'm rolling them out or doing this recipe, because my sugar cookie recipe has a lot of butter in it and I don't want the cookies to get overly browned. I also make sure that I put them in the middle of the oven, make sure that the rack is set in the middle and not at the top or the bottom, because the heat is potentially more extreme at both of those ends. And I also make sure that I turn the cookies around halfway through. I don't flip them, but I turn the tray around so that the parts that were toward the back are now toward the front, and vice versa, because sometimes the back of the oven can be hotter than the front, since the front is where the door is and heat can escape, especially when you're checking the oven to see if the cookies are ready. So just make sure that you turn them partway through. You're going to bake them for about 15 to 20 minutes. These took in my oven, the batch that I've already done, 19 minutes. So I would recommend setting your timer for maybe 7 or 8 minutes and then checking them and turning them around and setting it for another 7 or 8, and then paying attention the last 5 minutes to make sure that they're not overly browning. I will go ahead and show you when my batch is out what they should look like when they're ready to come out of the oven. I just turned my cookies, so they have about 9 more minutes or so to bake. But I can show you now some things you might prep while you're getting ready. Obviously, if you have some candies that are in foil, like Rolos and Hershey Kisses, you can take those out of the foil. If you have gumdrops, that may not be necessary. But the other thing you will want to prep is if you have some licorice lace, you'll want to get that cut so that it's the right size for your cookies. I think approximately 6 inches is good for a scarf. So you'll want to take your lace and cut 6-inch pieces for as many scarves as you're going to need. And then if you'd like to use pieces for smiles, about 1 inch will work for that, or maybe just a little bit less, but 1 inch seems to be enough to get it to turn up and smile if you'd like your Frosties to smile. So you can just use some utility scissors, or if you don't have a pair of kitchen utility scissors, you could use another pair of scissors. Just make sure that you wash them and dry them well before you use them to cut your licorice into pieces. Here you can see my licorice pieces cut. I've used Twizzlers watermelon flavor, pull and peel, I think they call it. It's the watermelon flavor because that has both red and green strings to it. So I can do some different colors and not just do all red. And I've cut some of them up as well to do some mouths. But you can also cut them to make arms if you'd like. Probably a couple of inches, 2 to 3 maybe would be sufficient. But you might just want to measure the body of your Frosties in case yours are a little bit larger or a little bit smaller than mine, to see what might be appropriate. Another tip I would give you with regard to the licorice lace is this Twizzlers pull and peel. A couple of times when I was tying scarves, it broke for me. A piece of it broke off and I had to start over. So having a little bit extra is helpful, since it didn't really need the full 6 inches. It was fine when I cut, when it broke off. if I had cut less, then I probably would have had to either recut those pieces to make arms or mouths, or else I would have just not been able to use them. So keep that in mind too, slightly longer. 6 inches or even a little more for the scarves is helpful to start, so that in case it breaks while you're tying, you might still be able to use it for a scarf. The Twizzlers pull and peel was about 8 inches long each string, so I then basically used the remainder to make the mouths. So you can eat the parts that you cut off if you want to, or you can actually reserve them and use them for other parts, especially the mouths, because those are short. But they might work as well for arms, depending on the size of your cookies. So here are the cookies out of the oven. As you can see, they've lost a little bit of their ball shape. They flattened just a bit, but they have held up so that they do look like snowmen. And you'll know that they're done because if you press against it, it'll be just a little bit spongy. I don't know if you can see how it's giving a bit, but then it's bouncing back. You don't want it to go too long because then it's going to be hard and it won't have any give at all, and you'll have a crunchy cookie, which is fine for dunking, but you might want to be careful if you've got issues with chewing. So it should be just a little bit brown. It'll definitely be browner on the bottom, but usually around the edges it's a little bit brown. And then if you press on it just a bit along the side, it should give a little bit but bounce back. So those cookies need to cool, but I can show you with a cookie from the batch that I already made what you need to do to decorate. You do want to let your cookies cool completely, because you especially don't want to be spreading any frosting on the cookie and have it kind of melt. You want the frosting to stay firm, and so you can use as little as necessary to, especially to stick the hats to the tops of the snowmen. So you'll have your cookie decorating parts together, your hats, your scarves, and potentially your mouths. I can show you a couple of different ways to do the mouths, and you'll have your frosting. And once your cookies are completely cooled, what I recommend doing is do the hat last, because that will need to be firmly affixed and you'll want to make sure it's sticking. And if you're picking up the cookie to do other kinds of decoration, then the hat will potentially fall off while you're doing that. So I did the hats last and started actually with the scarves. So I will basically take a piece of the longer 6-inch or so strands of licorice and wrap it around the cookie and just tie it so it looks like a scarf. So here you can see I've placed the lace behind, and I want to just pull it together here toward the front, and you can tie it either right in front or you can tie it on the side. You only need to tie it once. You don't need to tie it like you would a pair of shoes. Just tie it once to wrap it around, and then once it's wrapped around, you can just pull it gently so that it's secured. I don't know if you can see, but it's a little bit more secure. I unfortunately can't show you tying because the camera doesn't have a tripod for me to place it on. But you can see here that the lace is pulled as tightly as possible without pulling too much, because I found that the green is actually a little bit more brittle than the red for this watermelon Twizzler pull and peel. So I've been especially careful with this green piece of lace, but the red was a little thicker, so I might pull a little more. But you can tuck it if you'd like. You can cut the ends off if you want, but that's not necessary. It looks just fine, I think, like this. Depends on your preferences and how artistic you'd like to be. So for the mouths, one option is to paste one of these pieces of licorice if you've cut some of these. I recommend, if you do kind of want to make your Frosties smile, maybe bend the licorice a bit and get it to flex in like a U shape first, because it kind of wants to go straight. otherwise. So if you can get it to start to bend before you put it on the face, it will be easier to get it to stick as a smile if that's what you'd like. You can make all kinds of expressions. If you want some frowning Frosties, that's fine too, or if you want some somber looking Frosties. But if you'd like them to smile, do this for a bit until it seems to be staying up. And then you have two options. You can either take some frosting and you can paint it onto the piece of licorice if you'd like, and then press it onto the face and just hold it down for a little bit to make sure that it sticks, especially if you're trying to get it to smile. Hold it down on the corners to make sure that the corners don't bend back down. It won't smile quite like this, but it'll at least be turned up instead of straight if you do this. The other option is you can just go ahead and paint some frosting right onto the face if you'd like, and then stick the licorice on that, which is what I have done. So here I've just pressed the licorice against the frosting and it's turned up a bit, but it did lose a lot of its U shape, but at least it's turned up and is smiling. And I want to hold on to that for a bit, especially at the edges here, to get it to stick and especially to look like it's smiling. These pieces of licorice are about 1 inch and they're just a little bit larger than they probably ought to be for these. So I can take the utility scissors and come in from the top and just snip the edges off then if I'd like them to be more proportionate. But if you don't care, you can just leave them. It really doesn't matter. Often kids don't care, and the more licorice they have to eat, the happier they are. So it really depends on your preferences. You can also try cutting smaller pieces, but the smaller pieces are a little bit harder to work with. So cutting less to start with may make it harder for you to get it on to the cookie in the first place, rather than if you've got nice utility scissors that will cut well, then you might just do what I've done and I'll just cut some of that off. My utility scissors are really nice and sharp. If you don't have a good pair of utility scissors, then you can either just say you don't care, or you can cut them the right size before and just kind of hold them up to the face and see what works best for you before you even cut them, or just snip a bit off if it's too long once you've already cut your pieces. There are a number of ways you can do this. Do what works for you depending on what you like and the size of your cookies. So as you can see, I've just cut a little bit off. I just went in straight from the top and just cut a little bit and pushed those bits to the side. So the last thing that you need to do is put the hat on the Frosty. You can obviously do other decorations if you'd like as well. You can use some frosting to stick some more pieces of licorice on the sides for arms. You can get creative with it. If you want to give your snow people belts, you can do another piece of licorice around the waist. Your choice, right? You might do a belt, you might do arms, especially if you have people in your family who really like the licorice. It can be fun to do that. But the last thing we're going to do here is just put a hat on our Frosties. And I recommend in this case, whatever kind of candy you're using for the top, just spread a decent layer of frosting. See how that frosting is thick and it's sticking to the bottom of my Rolo. There's enough there that you can't really see through the frosting to see that there's chocolate underneath. It's a nice solid white layer, but you don't need to lay it on too thick. If you do and you get extra, you can always use a toothpick or some other knife or the tine of a fork, something that is delicate and straight that can get in there and get the excess around the top if you care, or you can just leave the frosting on since frosting is good on cookies. And then I just put the candy right on the head like this, and I'm going to hold this here for a little bit to make sure that the frosting has a chance to stick, and it'll dry a bit and it'll be firmly fixed then. And you can see that there's some frosting there that's sticking out. If you want to be very precise, you can use a toothpick and just go around and get the excess and put it back, and that'll give you more frosting to use for other cookies. Or you can leave it like that, and it kind of looks like there's a white brim to the hat, or looks like maybe there's some snow since Frosty's made of snow. However you want to do it is fine. Be creative, have fun with it. And see, it's already sticking for me. And you can see here too at the back, it's just a bit brown in the back and a little bit darker up top because those heads are smaller probably than the base. So it got a little bit darker there. And that's your Frosty cookie, your basic Frosty cookie. Another option for putting smiles on the cookie, I mentioned if you have larger heads, you can always use pieces of candy like the mini chocolate chips. You can also take some decorative frosting and draw on it. If you want to make your own, you can color the frosting with enough to make it the color that you want. Just take some of your frosting aside that you're using already for gluing the hats and the licorice and put some of that along to make a smile or any other expression you want. And yeah, those are the three basic ways that you can do a smile: the licorice, the colored frosting, and the chocolate chips or other small pieces of candy that are the same size. So those are basic Frosty cookies. Making them is fairly easy, especially if you have everything ready to go and you use ready-made frosting and ready-made roll-out cookie dough, and you just use pieces of things to put together. But you can get creative. Anything that looks kind of like a hat that is the appropriate size candy can go on top as a hat, and other pieces of candy that are the same size as those mini chips will work too for buttons and for eyes and nose. Different things you can add to. You could add a pipe if you'd like using the licorice potentially. It depends on how creative you want to get. You can even just go ahead and decorate everything yourself if you're feeling that ambitious and you're artistic about it. If you have the cake decorating supplies, you can just have different colors of frosting that you pipe and actually put the buttons and different things on for yourself rather than using mini chocolate chips like a good cake decorator would. But if you want to just make something quick and easy and fun, this is the easiest way to do it. So I hope that this is a fun activity for you, for kids, anyone in the family who likes making and decorating cookies.